Okay, so now that we've finished our feature engineering, let's move on to actually building our model. So as you can see, I've switched my branch to the GBDT regression model branch. So in this branch, I'm going to be building a gradient boosted tree regression model, simply because tree models are always just a good way to start out with the more advanced modeling techniques. They're simple to interpret. Hyperparameters are fairly easy to optimize. They're quick to fit. So just overall, like a very good starting point when building a more advanced model. So let's jump in to the train.py file. If you recall, the train.py file from our baseline model was fairly simple. We imported a baseline model class and then just simply ran our training and logged some metrics using a predefined compute metric. That has all been removed or changed in this version of train.py, starting with the model. So the model that we're importing is a tree model. This is a wrapper class around the LightGBM gradient boosted tree package. So let's go into the models.py file, take a look. So in the models.py file, we have this tree model class. The only input is params argument. So the params is just a dictionary that takes in the LightGBM initialization parameters. There's a fit method similar to our baseline model fit method. The goal is these model classes have the same interface for fitting data and predicting so that you can change what's going on underneath without actually affecting the training code. So in this fit method, what we're doing is we take in this xtrain, ytrain, xvalid, yvalid data frames, and then we build the LightGBM dataset object that LightGBM library uses to fit the model. We then train the model using the parameters that we initialize this class with, and we validate we compute the validation metrics on the training set and the validation set. This is just how the LightGBM API is set up. If you want to log metrics from your training set, you have to pass it in as a list in this valid sets argument. And finally, we have the predict and load and save functions or methods. Sorry, always get those mixed up. Predict is very straightforward. Just takes in an array and outputs an array as a prediction. The load just loads in a pickled model to the model class, and save will just save the model using the LightGBM save model method to a particular path that's passed in. Jumping back to train.py. So we have a few input arguments. So the input arguments that haven't changed are artifact name and artifact version. Artifact name in this case will be the features that we just engineered. Version will be the latest that we're using. Target name just tells LightGBM which column in our data frame is the target that we're trying to predict. And the only new arguments I've introduced here in this file are a smoke test fraction, and optimizer config. What is a smoke test, right? Let's get into that. So before we run our training on our entire data set, we want to make sure that everything is working. Is the model able to ingest the data correctly? Is it getting the right data set to fit? Is it able to make the predictions? Is it logging the correct metrics? All these things we want answered, and we don't want to wait for the model to take a whole bunch of time to fit the data before we have these answers. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the smoke test flag right here. And with the smoke test flag, what the smoke test will do is it will sample, you can see here, it will sample the feature data set and then run the entire training and evaluation with this sample. So this is a sample of the already sampled data set. So it'll be probably a few thousand examples, depending on the fraction that we pick. So this is just to run the pipeline quickly, verify that everything is working, everything is showing up the way we expect it, and that when we do eventually run our training on the full data set, we will log everything as expected. So the other parameter I want to talk about now is smoke test fraction. So I'm going to be, the first experiment I'm going to run with this script is the smoke test, just to verify that everything is being logged. The second set of experiments that I am going to run involves gradually increasing the smoke test fraction till we essentially fit the entire feature data set, right? So this is what's called a learning curve experiment. So a learning curve is different from a loss curve. A learning curve is essentially um, logging the results of a model run as you gradually increase the size of the data set between each run. The reason you do this is you want to verify that is adding more data to your problem solving actually helping your model learn better. So what we would expect when increasing like training and evaluating the model is that our validation metric, in this case it will be the validation root mean squared error, we would expect that to decrease as the size of the data set increases. So we would have a descending curve because we might see that when we generate this learning curve that increasing the size of the data set isn't really helping our model much. We could see that beyond a certain point or beyond a certain size, learning plateaus. And in that case, it might mean that there's no reason to conduct a hyperparameter search because adding more data is not necessarily improving model performance. The last parameter I want to talk about is the optimizer config. So once we finish the learning curve experiments, we'll run a sweep on top of this data set and the hyperparameters. And the optimizer config is just a path to the Comet optimizer JSON. This is just a JSON. It contains all the parameters we need for our hyperparameter search. We're only going to be sweeping 3 parameters, and there's only 2 values for each of them. When conducting a hyperparameter search, it is best to do this in phases with very large, let's say like you want to sweep a very large interval for your parameters initially, and then slowly narrow down the space iteratively. This is so that you don't waste a lot of time searching for like these in-between parameters that like may not necessarily give you a significant boost in performance. So for number of leaves, I'm searching between a very small number of leaves and a very large number of leaves. Same with number of estimators. I'm starting with 100 and then going up to 1,000. And I've set the type for all of these parameters as discrete. So that means that I'm not searching for anything between 100 or 1,000. I'm only searching for the number of estimators being 100 or the number of estimators being 1,000. So with a random search, this sort of results in a search space of 8 potential configurations. And from these 8 potential configurations, I can get an idea of which parameters most dramatically affect model performance. You'll also notice that I haven't added any regularization parameters here. I'm not really interested in finding the best model just yet. I shouldn't say that. I'm actually I don't care if we overfit at this stage, because if we overfit, at least that's a sign the model can learn from this data, can learn something from this data. My goal here is just to identify like a narrow set of parameters and then verify that learning is possible. So that is why I haven't added any regularization, totally fine with overfitting. Regularization is something that comes in the later stages once you have verified that your model has the capacity to learn from data. So in the optimizer config, what we're doing is if the optimizer config is detected as an argument, we call this run optimizer method, and we run our sweep, which is just basically using the Comet optimizer to create an experiment, fetching the parameters of interest from the experiment, and then initializing our tree model with these parameters, and then running our train and evaluation function. So we also have this evaluation pipeline, which is part of this evaluate.py file. And what the evaluation pipeline is doing is it's just a wrapper around maybe individual operations that you want to use to evaluate your model. So for now, I'm going to get the metrics auto-logged from Comet's LightGBM autologger. So as part of my evaluation, what I want to do is I want to log the model predictions to Comet in my experiment. And I'm going to log these predictions in a particular way. So I'm going to first compute sample-wise metrics. So for each sample and prediction pair, target and prediction pair, I'm going to compute the root mean squared error for that pair. And so I get a big vector or array of losses. And then I'm going to sort them and get the largest losses. So these are the worst performing examples. And I'm going to log these samples to Comet so that I can then sort of debug what it is that is affecting the model. So I could look at the features that are difficult for the model to predict and then maybe make adjustments to my modeling process that way. The predictions will be logged as a excuse me. The predictions will be logged as a table to Comet as a predictions.json file. I know that in our framework documentation for this project, we said we would log the predictions as a CSV file. It just, in terms of like visualization, JSON is, I guess, user-friendly. We've made a switch for that. And so now our predictions will be logged to Comet as a JSON so that it's easier for us to load them into panels and then visualize what is happening in our model. And then along with the predictions, we're also going to log the features as well as the target value. So we can compare like what targets our model is struggling with, what are the features that correspond to this target, and hopefully it will give us a little more insight into what we need to change in order to make a good model. And I think that is about it for the entire pipeline and evaluation. Yeah, finally, we're going to log this model as a model.pickle file and call it gbdt regression. And I think this is it. Yep. If you're curious about this file, how it's structured, you can always check the gbdt regression model branch on our project repo. And if there are any questions, comments, like please feel free to comment below. I've already run the training run for this. So let's switch over to our experiment view to see the smoke test, the learning curve experiments, and the hyperparameter search.